My name is Clara Mitchell, and at 29 years old, I can tell you this. It's been 6 long months since I packed my life into boxes and moved out here to Colorado. 6 months of quiet mornings, new routines, and wide skies. And in all that time, not a single phone call, not a single text, not even an email from my parents. Not once did they ask where I'd gone. Not once did they wonder why my lease, back in Raleigh, North Carolina, suddenly ended. Not once did they notice that the birthday card they mailed never reached me. Not that they even remembered my birthday. And if you've ever felt that kind of betrayal, the kind that cuts deep because it comes from the people who should have been your biggest supporters, then you already understand. I still remember that last day in Raleigh like it happened yesterday. The sun was unseasonably hot for March. Heat shimmered off the sidewalks, and sweat ran down my back as I taped the last few boxes shut. My best friend Evan bent low, grunting as he lifted a crate full of dishes and pots I'd collected over the years. On the other side of the room, Maya knelt by my suitcase, folding down the flaps with her knee before sliding the tape across. The one-bedroom apartment I had lived in for almost a decade was nearly empty by then. The walls echoed when we spoke, the air heavy with the smell of cardboard and dust. All that remained were towers of boxes stacked neatly by the door, and the worn-out armchair I hadn't bothered to sell. "You sure you're not going to tell them?" Maya asked me, her sleeve wiping at the sweat on her forehead. Her voice carried that mix of concern and disbelief I'd grown used to hearing. "I mean, just a text, or something." I looked up from where I was scribbling bedroom. "Donate" across a box in thick black marker. "They haven't asked where I live in 3 years," I said. "Why would I tell them I'm leaving?" She didn't push me further. She just glanced at Evan, who gave a low whistle and muttered under his breath, "Still wild to me." But it wasn't wild to me. It was expected. Normal. The Mitchell family had a way of reminding me where I stood. Or rather, where I didn't. I'd been the extra in their family portrait for as long as I could remember. Background. The quiet one. The invisible one. Acceptable only when I was useful. My brother, Aaron, was the sun, the centerpiece, the reason the camera always flashed. Everything rotated around him, his grades, his games, his future. Me. I was the filler on the edges of the photo. The U-Haul we had rented creaked as Evan heaved in the last box, setting it carefully against the others. I reached up, both hands flat against the metal door, and pulled it shut. It clicked closed, and for a moment I just stood there, my palms still pressed to the warm surface. I stared at the building that had been my home all those years, not because it was full of memories worth keeping, but because it was full of silence, ready. Evan called, twirling the truck keys around his finger. I nodded. More than ready. The drive from North Carolina to Colorado stretched long and quiet. The further we went, the more the world shifted outside the window. City grit and crowded freeways gave way to rolling plains, then to forests of tall pines. The air thinned, grew sharper, and by the time we crossed into Colorado, I felt something in me loosen. Like I'd finally unclenched my jaw after years of holding it tight. My new apartment wasn't fancy. Just a one-bedroom on the 2nd floor, with an outdated kitchen and a balcony so narrow I could barely stand 2 chairs out there. But it was mine. Mine in a way nothing else had ever been. I hung my own pictures on the walls. I set up my desk exactly how I wanted. I cooked full meals without anyone interrupting or ignoring me. I woke early, logged into work, watered the little pots of herbs lined up by the kitchen window. Life was simple, but it was mine. Evan and Maya drove out every other weekend, sometimes bringing takeout, sometimes just sitting with me on the balcony until the stars came out. And my grandmother, Agnes, called every single week without fail. She never missed. Not once, no one else called. Some nights I laughed about it. Not bitter laughter, not sharp or angry, but that hollow kind that echoes in an empty room. because I realized I had disappeared, and no one had even blinked, not until last week. That was when the phone rang and a name lit up the screen. I froze, just stared at it. Thomas Mitchell, my father. The name looked like it belonged to someone else, from another lifetime. For 3 rings, I did nothing. On the 4th, I picked up. His voice came through, clipped, impatient, already irritated. "You need to come home next weekend." That was it. No hello. No how have you been. Just a command, sharp and flat. And I should have known exactly what it meant. The tone wasn't disappointment. It wasn't worry. It was entitlement. I was being summoned, not invited. Not wanted, summoned. I didn't ask for details. I simply told him. I already have plans, and hung up before he could launch into his usual lecture. Then I leaned back in my chair, staring out the sliding glass door at the ridge of pine trees behind my apartment, and I felt that old familiar weight settle over me again. Not sadness, not shock, just recognition. This was how it had always been. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in the kitchen with my report card laid neatly on the table, where I knew Mum would sit for her morning tea. 3 straight semesters on the honour roll. I thought maybe she'd look up, smile, ask a question. Instead, she glanced down once and said, "Good job, honey," without lifting her eyes from her phone. That same week, Aaron came home with a C+ on a math quiz and still got to pick where we ate dinner. The year I won first place in the regional science fair, I carried home a trophy half as tall as me. My teacher pulled me aside that morning, said I should be proud. And I wanted them to be proud too. I set that trophy on the counter, where Dad couldn't miss it. At dinner, I waited. Finally, he sighed and said, "Let's not make a big deal out of it. Clara, your brother has finals." That was the year I stopped bringing awards home. By the time I was 17, I knew one thing with certainty. I would be paying for college myself. No questions asked, no offers made. I earned a scholarship to a state school, picked up 2 part-time jobs, and stopped going home for breaks. It was easier that way. Cleaner. I graduated early, shared a cramped apartment with strangers, and took whatever freelance work I could find. My resume grew faster than my social life, but I didn't mind. Work was something I could control. Work didn't forget me at the dinner table. Eventually, I landed a solid job with a cybersecurity firm based out of Denver. Remote work, good pay, full benefits. I'd been there nearly 3 years now, and my boss said I had a knack for unraveling the problems other engineers overlooked. My savings account finally had commas in it. My fridge had real food. My email inbox even had a pre-approval letter from a mortgage broker. I was 29 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was thinking about buying a house. Nothing big, just mine. So when my father's voice tried to pull me back into obligation, back into performance, back into being a placeholder in the family photo, I didn't flinch. I didn't bend. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to realize I wasn't coming. When my father finally spoke again, his words weren't a question. They were an order. "You need to come home next weekend." I leaned back in my chair, the phone hot against my ear. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady, though I already knew this had nothing to do with me. There was a pause, the kind where I could almost hear him roll his eyes the way he always did when he thought I was being difficult. Then he said it. "Your brother's engagement dinner. Hannah's parents want to meet the whole family. They're very traditional, of course. Not a reunion. Not a reconnection. Not even curiosity about where I'd been for the past 6 months. No, this was about a performance. Another family portrait where I was nothing more than a daughter-shaped placeholder. I won't be there," I said simply. The line went sharp. "What do you mean you won't be there?" "I mean exactly what I said. I have other plans. Clara, this is important for your brother's future, he pressed. They're high-profile people. It will reflect badly on us if you don't show up. And there it was. Us. Never me. Never how I was doing or what I wanted. Always about the optics, the family image, the reputation. I moved to Colorado 6 months ago, I said, keeping my tone calm. I'm not flying across the country for a dinner I wasn't even invited to until now. There was silence on the line. Not the peaceful kind. The charged kind. The kind that feels like air right before a thunderstorm. You moved to Colorado without telling us? He asked, his voice low and sharp. You didn't know where I was before, I replied. Why would this be different? How dare you move without telling your family? What's your address? I almost laughed. Do you even remember my last one? He didn't answer, and that silence told me everything. That's not the point, he snapped. It's exactly the point, I said. You're not asking because you care. You're asking because now it's inconvenient not to know. Clara, he said, his voice rising, this isn't how families work. No, I said quietly, but it's how ours always has. And with that, I hung up. My hand didn't even tremble. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting the silence return like a tide rushing back in. Then, inevitably, the phone lit up again. Missed call, then another, then a text, then first from him, then from my mother, then even from Aaron. I didn't answer. I turned the phone off, made myself a cup of tea, and stepped out onto the balcony. The sky was fading to indigo, the pine trees just shadows against the last light dot. By morning, the messages had shifted. From reminders into guilt. From guilt into threats. 6 voicemails. 11 texts. 2 emails with subject lines like family should stick together and can we talk. And then my mother finally called when I answered. Her voice was tight, trying too hard to sound warm, like she was following a script she didn't believe. Sweetheart, she began, this isn't like you. You've always been so respectful. Your brother's counting on you. Hannah's parents are formal people. We need to show unity. Unity. The word tasted bitter. Unity meant nothing when it was only pulled out for guests. I'm not going, I said simply. Clara, don't be difficult. I'm not, I replied. I'm being honest. She sighed, frustration bleeding into her tone. It's just one dinner. You don't have to stay long. Smile, say a few words, and then you can disappear again if that's what you want. You mean like I already have? I asked. Her silence told me she knew exactly what I meant. And then, without another word, she hung up. Aaron tried next. His voice was softer, less demanding, more confused. Look, I don't know what's going on between you and Mom and Dad, he said, but can't you just show up for me? For a second, I almost felt something. Almost. But then I remembered all the years he looked away while I was overlooked. All the birthdays, all the dinners, all the moments he let pass without speaking up. No, I said finally. Not this time. The next day, my father called again. The pretense was gone now. His voice was steel. If you don't show up to this wedding, he said, you're out of the will. I let the silence stretch, long enough for him to believe I was weighing the threat. Then I said calmly, I make more money than all of you combined. I heard him inhale sharply, like the words had struck him. You're bluffing. If you'd ever asked about my life, I said, you'd know I'm not. And then he hung up. That was the last call I took. From then on, I just watched the messages roll in like waves. First urgent, then pleading, then angry again. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I opened my laptop, clicked back to the real estate listing I'd bookmarked a week earlier. A house, 3 bedrooms, Cedar siding. Room for a garden, it was still there. Waiting the next morning, my grandmother called. Grandma Agnes, the only person I always answered. She never asked permission to call. She never asked if I was free. She just dialed, and I always picked up. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady, carrying that rare mix of gentleness and knowing. "How's the air up there today?" "Cool and quiet," I said, "just the way I like it." We talked for a while about small things. The lavender I'd planted in a pot on the balcony. The deer that sometimes wandered behind the building. Little pieces of life. Then she paused. "They asked me to call you," she said finally. Not apologizing, just telling the truth. "I figured," I said. "Let me guess. Convince me to come back and play the part." "They didn't use those words," she admitted. "But yes. Your mother's been pacing. Your father's in a mood. They're panicking because they miss you." She hesitated, then added softly, "Because Hannah's parents are asking questions." I laughed under my breath. Of course. My value had finally surfaced. Not tied to me. Tied neatly to someone else's expectations. "I'm not going, Grandma. I know," she said. I wouldn't either. And that's why I always answered her calls. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't excuse them. She didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. She remembered my birthdays. She sent postcards from her little trips. She asked about my work and actually listened to the answers. She was the only one who ever looked straight at me and saw more than what I could provide. "I just wanted you to hear it from someone honest," she said. "Not because I think you owe them anything." "Thank you," I said softly. "Are you okay?" She asked. "I am," I told her. And this time, I meant it. Really? Really, we stayed on the phone until my tea went cold. She asked about the house I'd been looking at, whether I'd paint the walls or leave them plain. We talked about furniture, about fig trees, about everything except obligation. By the time we hung up, the sun had filled the room with light, and I'd already opened the mortgage calculator again. The morning of the wedding came faster than I expected. Even though I wasn't going, I woke early anyway, almost out of habit. My body carried the old rhythm of family events, the rush of showers, the stiff dresses, the smell of perfume and starch, the nerves that never belonged to me, but somehow landed on my shoulders anyway. Only this time, I wasn't part of it. I was 3 states away, sipping coffee on my balcony, watching sunlight spill over the Rockies. The pine trees glowed gold, the air sharp and clean. My phone buzzed face down on the table. I didn't need to look to know what it was. Another flood of reminders, of guilt, of last-minute demands. I didn't answer. Instead, I poured another cup of coffee and pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. I tried to imagine the scene back in Ohio. My mother fussing with her hair, tugging at her dress. My father pacing, jaw tight, rehearsing whatever speech he thought might impress Hannah's parents. Aaron smiling too hard, trying to hold everyone together, while Hannah glowed in the center of it all. And then the question. The question I knew would come. Where's Clara? I could hear it in Hannah's mother's voice, polite but pointed. I could see my father stiffen, see my mother plaster on a smile too wide. She couldn't make it, they would say. Or maybe she's busy. And that would be it. My absence would hang over them like a shadow they couldn't explain away. For years, I'd been invisible inside that family. But today, my absence was the loudest thing in the room. The thought made me laugh. Not cruelly, just quietly. Like I'd finally slipped free of a net I hadn't realized was still wrapped around me. By noon, the calls grew frantic. My mother left a message, her voice shaking. "Clara, please. Just come for the reception. Just an hour. People are asking questions." I didn't answer. At 2, Aaron called. His voice was tired, softer than usual. "Look," he said, "I know you don't want to be here. I know you feel like nobody notices you, but this is my wedding. I don't want to spend the whole day worrying about whether my sister's going to walk through the door or not." I let the voicemail play twice before deleting it. It wasn't about not being noticed. It was about only being noticed when it benefited someone else. And Aaron, for all his kindness, had never once stood up to change that dot. By late afternoon, I'd muted the phone completely. I went for a hike instead, up a trail I'd been meaning to try. The climb was steady, my boots crunching on dry dirt and pine needles. The higher I went, the quieter the world became, until all I could hear was my own breathing and the occasional bird darting through the trees. When I reached the overlook, I sat on a flat rock and pulled out a granola bar. Below me, the valley stretched wide and green, the river catching the last of the light. It felt endless, untouched, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. I stayed until the sun dipped low, until the shadows stretched long. When I finally made my way back down, my phone had 23 missed calls. I didn't answer any of them. That night, I made dinner for myself. Nothing fancy. Just roasted vegetables, a little bread, a glass of wine. I ate slowly, letting the quiet of the apartment wrap around me. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, the reception was winding down. The music was fading, the speeches were over, the glasses of champagne nearly empty. I pictured my parents already spinning the story they'd tell tomorrow. She's busy with work. She's living in Colorado. Now, you know. She has her own life. Both true. Neither honest. The next morning I awoke to an email from my father. Short, cold. "You've embarrassed us for the last time. Don't expect to be welcome in this family again." I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and went for another walk. I thought maybe I'd feel guilty. Maybe I'd feel the loss, the finality of it. But all I felt was light. Like someone had finally cut loose a rope I hadn't realized was still tied around my chest. Later that day, Grandma called. She didn't ask why I hadn't gone. She didn't lecture. She just said, "How's the weather out there?" "Sunny," I told her. "Cool breeze. Perfect hiking weather." "That's good," she said. "I hope you went." I did. Good girl. We talked about her garden, about the tomatoes she was trying to coax into ripening early, about the little blue house on Main Street she'd noticed had gone up for sale. She told me she thought I'd like it, with its big porch and climbing roses. For the first time, I admitted it out loud. "I'm ready to buy a place." Her voice warmed. "I think that's exactly what you should do." After we hung up, I pulled up the listing again. Not the one she'd mentioned, though I looked at that too, but the cedar-sided house in the foothills. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen big enough for baking, enough yard for vegetables and flowers. I could see it so clearly. The dining table I'd choose myself. The bookshelf I'd finally build. The light through the windows in the morning, not filtered through anyone else's expectations. I made an appointment to see it the next day. That night, while my parents were no doubt replaying the wedding in their heads, rehearsing how to explain my absence to their friends, I lay in bed smiling. But because I had finally made a choice for myself, without their voices in the room, and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. The next morning, I drove out to see the house. It sat at the end of a gravel road, tucked between tall pines and open sky. The siding was weathered cedar, the kind that smelled faintly of wood and rain. The porch wrapped around the front, wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table. The kind of place where you could drink coffee in the morning or watch storms roll in at night. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the heavy, suffocating kind I'd grown up with, but the soft kind, the kind that holds you. The floors creaked in places, but they felt steady under my boots. Sunlight spilled across the living room, warming the walls. The kitchen was simple, nothing glamorous, just space that begged to be used. A window over the sink looked out toward the mountains. I walked through each room slowly. 3 bedrooms. One for me, one maybe for guests, if I ever chose to have them. One for an office, a studio, or maybe just a place to leave the door closed when I wanted. By the time I circled back to the front door, I already knew. This was it. The realtor asked if I wanted to think about it. I shook my head. I don't need to. That afternoon, I signed the papers. For years, my family had told me what mattered. Appearances, traditions, unity at all costs. But standing there, pen in hand, I realized something. This was the first decision I'd made that belonged only to me. No compromise. No performance. No permission asked. When I left the office, the keys heavy in my pocket, I didn't feel nervous. I felt free. The next few weeks passed in a blur of boxes and plans. I bought paint swatches, measuring tape, even a tool set I didn't quite know how to use yet. I drove to thrift shops and second-hand stores, picking out furniture piece by piece. A table I could sand down, a bookshelf wide enough for all the novels I'd collected, but never unpacked. It wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing. Every single thing inside that house was chosen by me, for me. I kept the phone off most days. My parents had gone quiet after my father's last email. No more calls. No more guilt trips. Not even Erin tried again. At first, that silence felt strange, like a missing tooth you keep running your tongue over. But then, day by day, it began to feel like space. Room to breathe. Only Grandma kept calling. She asked about paint colors, about where I'd put the garden, about whether I'd buy a rocking chair for the porch. She laughed when I told her I'd nearly dropped a hammer on my foot trying to hang a shelf. "You'll get the hang of it," she said. "That house is going to hold you." I believed her. The first night I slept there. The house felt both too big and exactly right. The rooms echoed a little, the way empty spaces do before they've absorbed enough life. But the air was calm, the quiet deep. I curled up under a blanket, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. No footsteps. No doors slamming. No voices whispering about appearances or obligations. Just me, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt home. A week later, I got a postcard in the mail. It was from Grandma. On the front, a photo of the sea, waves crashing against rocks. On the back, in her tidy handwriting, she'd written, "Families can be built, not just born. Proud of you. Love, Grandma." I pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a sunflower. Every time I saw it, it reminded me of something I hadn't fully admitted before. I hadn't lost a family. I'd chosen the part of it that mattered, and left the rest behind. The seasons shifted. Summer folded into fall. The air turned crisp, the mountains streaked with golden red. I planted bulbs in the yard, imagining them breaking through the soil come spring. I found a rhythm. Work during the day, walks in the evening, tea on the porch at night. Some days I invited neighbors over for coffee. Other days I kept to myself, perfectly content. My parents never reached out again. Maybe they meant it. Maybe they were waiting me out. But I never checked. I never opened the door to Wonder Dot, because here, in this house, I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. On Thanksgiving, Grandma came to visit. She brought pies, a knitted blanket, and her steady presence. We sat at the dining table I'd refinished, eating until we couldn't move. Afterward, she leaned back in her chair, smiling at me. "This feels right," she said. "It does," I agreed. We washed dishes side by side, then sat on the porch, wrapped in the blanket. watching the stars climb the sky. For once, the holiday wasn't about forced smiles or keeping peace. It was about warmth, about being seen, about being exactly where I wanted to be. Months later, I walked through the house and realized it no longer felt empty. The shelves were full. The walls held color. The air carried the smell of lavender from the garden. It felt lived in. It felt alive. I thought about the wedding sometimes, about the night I chose not to go, not with regret, but with clarity. That decision had been the line, the one that finally separated me from the version of myself that only existed in their expectations. I wasn't that person anymore. I was someone who built a home, who planted roots, who chose her own family, and maybe one day I'd expand it. Friends, neighbors, people who showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. But even if I didn't, I knew I was enough. The house, the quiet, the life I was shaping, it was all mine. And for the first time, when I looked in the mirror, I recognized myself, not the invisible daughter, not the placeholder, just Clara, exactly where she was meant to be.